Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Rich Besco. I'm a local 9/11 Truth activist. My friend Matt Mead and I used to put on a farmer's market booth for a couple of years. It seems down there. We haven't done it for a year and a half or so regarding this issue. I'd like to welcome you all. Thank you all for coming. Just some logistics real quickly. There are two exits. The one you came in probably right here. And out this way, there's a foyer, and if you turn to the right outside that door, there's another exit directly outside the building there. There are bathrooms here that are open all the time. You can get back in right through these doors when you want to go out there. There's a great bathroom out there, so please feel free to use the facilities if you need to. Just real quickly, we're going to, tonight, we're going to show Experts Speak Out. It's, Richard will talk a little bit more about that. But I just wanted to introduce local gentleman who's going to introduce Richard for you. His name is Robert McCoy. He's an architect that works on high-rise buildings. He specializes in large-scale projects. He's got more than six buildings in the San Francisco area, to his credit, up to 44 stories high. And without further ado, I'd like to have Robert come up and introduce Richard. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming and taking your time out from shopping and football on a Saturday afternoon, a beautiful Saturday afternoon, to come and see if we can educate you a little bit about what we have found out about what happened on that fateful day on 9/11/2001. Architects and Engineers is an organization that was started about 7 years ago by Richard Gage. He got interested in the issues, left his employment, and started this organization. It has grown to the point where now, just to put it in perspective a little bit, the organization exists on donations that are primarily in the $5 to $50 range, and this year we'll do close to $1 million in donations. So there is a movement. So there is a movement that's growing, and we are glad to see as many of you here as are here today. Richard is an architect, graduated from USC with a Bachelor of Architecture, licensed to practice architecture in the state of California, and is a member of the American Institute of Architects. It's the professional organization nationwide of architects, and you've probably seen the symbol AIA, and that's what it stands for, American Institute of Architects. He leads this organization. He has been the driving force, and without him, it would not exist. So without any further ado, Richard, what happened to you? Well, I guess he got cold feet. No, I don't think so. Maybe. Well, I guess I should. What else should I tell you about Richard? Until we find him.
You were in the video, I remember.
Pardon me?
Do I remember you from in the video?
Yes, I am in this video.
I was wondering what your background was and how you got involved.
How did this involve? My involvement in AA 9/11 Truth started about 4 or 5 years ago. A friend of mine has sent me a video of, I guess it was Building 7. He said, "What do you think?" And I spent a day searching around for videos of various things, and came across AA 9/11 Truth in the process. Read through their literature, did a little research, talked to some friends of mine who I saw had previously signed the petition. I then signed, and something I should tell you that most people aren't aware of, we now have 2,100 architects and engineers who have signed the petition. Every architect and engineer is vetted. We make sure that they are who they are and that they are in fact licensed before we admit that they're a member. And as a part of that process, they look into what your background is. And I have done tall buildings, and when they were combing through the signatures to put together the movie Experts Speak Out and look for people to sign, to speak, they contacted me, and did an interview, and that's how I got involved. Today I'm a member of the board. So, we found Richard. You ready?
Yeah.
All right, Richard Gage.
Thanks, everybody. There's two ways to give you this information, the cool way and the boring way. Today we're going to give you the cool way, so you're lucky. We have an incredible film. Well, I think it's incredible. I made it. But it's born by the fact that it's been seen by a whole lot of people on YouTube. We have it in the back. It's called 9/11 Explosive Evidence, Experts Speak Out. And I believe it's been shown before in San Luis Obispo. Is that correct, Matt?
Yes.
Yeah, so we're going to show it. How many of you have not seen it? Awesome. It's really important you see it. It's more important that you see it than you listen to me for 2 hours give this evidence, because what we have is 43 technical experts. We're talking about high-rise architects, such as Robert, whom you'll see in the movie today, right off the bat, in fact. Structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolitions experts, introducing the concept of all of the destruction of all 3 World Trade Center high-rises on 9/11. And the reason this is important will become apparent to you right off the bat in our introductory screen. So I won't give that away for you. The film is 88 minutes long. We will have an extensive Q&A afterwards. I will be the last one out of here, so all of our questions will be answered, not necessarily by me, but by those of you who have done a whole lot more research than myself. In fact, are there any architects here tonight, in addition to Robert? One. Great. I hope you guys will have a chance to chat. And if you could write that down. I've got my volunteer scribe here. We have 1 architect. How many engineers? 1, 2. Good, the engineer brought his pencil. 2. How many normal people? Yay! You had a question in the back.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Gage. I can't say it's a movie, but I'm convinced anyway.
That was easy. Right, we got to do this way more often, Robert. Did you have a question?
Yes. The billboard that was up a year and a half ago here in San Luis that advertised your organization.
Yes.
It was only up for a week?
How long was that billboard up, Matt? Bob?
5 weeks.
5
And
weeks,
that's
yeah.
about all we could afford. That was all done with 1 private donation of a local gentleman, Mark Phillips. We still have that canvas billboard. If anybody's interested, we might start a campaign to get it back up somewhere locally.
Well, yes, we'll ask either now or afterward how many of you would like to see that billboard up and can help us pay for it. Help us pay for it. The hands went down. What did it cost?
I think it was about $1,800. That included the printing. So I think it was about $1,500 a month, something like that.
That's cheap.
I'm not sure.
What did it say?
It basically said examine the evidence. We tried to get several messages, but it was, it was a little hard to get it approved by CBS Outdoor Advertising. They weren't totally against the concept, but they wanted to vet it, to screen the message. So the original few messages we turned in were, turned down, and so basically the message said examine the evidence, and then it had the architects and engineers logo was basically all it said.
Great. And you introduced yourself while I was out, right?
Yeah.
Sorry I missed that. And also, we want to find out where we are in the room today because relative to this information. This is not real easy information to open our minds to because of its implications. And at the end of the film, we discuss that in some detail. But going into it, we're going to find out, NIST did a poll, no, excuse me, a poll was done. I'll tell you what NIST is in a second. A poll was done by a newspaper, and they found that 16% of Americans believe that the Twin Towers were brought down not by planes and fires, as is the official story, but by explosives. That's extraordinary. And that's the hypothesis we'll be discussing today. But I want to find out how many of us, well, let me do a poll. I'll ask how many of us pretty much believe the official story as it stands. Jet planes impacted the building's large explosion of jet fuel, the ignition of the office contents, a large fire, and then the weakening of the structural steel and a gravitational collapse down to the ground. I'll ask you that question, and then you might be unsure what brought the towers down. You heard a few things. You're here to learn more, and some people may already come in convinced that they were blown up with explosives. So let's just ask those three questions now. How many believe the towers were brought down, according to the official story, by jet plane impacts and fires? Andrew, at least one, two, no more? That's it? That's it? Just two of you? Oh, well, how many of you are unsure? You might have heard a few things. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 unsure. And how many of you think the towers were already blown up with explosives? Look at this. Why don't you guys bring all your friends? Oh, you don't have any more friends. I see the problem. I've lost a few myself over the years doing this. Well, we have some tools which will hopefully help you bring them back into an understanding of what really happened there. It can be easy if you use us. Credibility. For credibility, for instance, like Robert, high-rise architects. I mean, here's a guy who's designed at least half a dozen high-rise buildings. And there's 2,000 architects and engineers backing him up, who as you'll hear from many of them today, talking about this evidence. So this becomes a simple little DVD. It's not that simple, but it is little. It can fit in your front pocket. And there's another DVD that is only 15 minutes that talks just about that third skyscraper, which we're going to be learning about right away. And that's Ed Asner narrates this film. It's just 15 minutes. It's incredible. In fact, if you pressure me, I might play it for you if after everybody goes home who doesn't want to hear any more. There's a few of us like that once in a while. So are there any questions before we begin the film? In the back.
How many belong to the AIA?
There are over 100 members of the American Institute of Architects among our 2,000 architects and engineers. There are many more architects. Not all architects become members of the AIA. Yes, another question over here.
I've always found the evidence with the World Trade Center buildings pretty compelling right off the bat. Does A&E ever talk about the Pentagon? Because that evidence seems fairly convincing.
Yeah, there's some very good information about the Pentagon. We don't talk about it per se, and I'll answer that question afterward, but there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation and confusing information about the Pentagon. And then the other plane that went down in Shanksville wasn't even about a building. So for those two reasons, the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth stick with the World Trade Center destruction. It becomes a lot easier to, as you'll see, tell people about. There was a question on this side? Yes?
Did you collaborate with Tishman, the builders of the World Trade Center? Did you get any information from them? Because they're the architects and the builders that put that building together. I mean, the actual builders were Tishman. I
haven't made an effort to connect with them. I think it's a great idea. I think we should. I can tell you exactly what we'll find when we do, though, which is probably why I never tried. Because in trying to connect with people who are in positions of great financial responsibility like that, they tend to favor the official story and not even talk to us, such as the leadership of the American Institute of Architects, who will not even engage with us, even though this evidence, as you'll see, is quite overwhelmingly convincing. Scientific forensic evidence is indisputable. So it's irrefutable. It has been disputed, but these are vain attempts, as we'll talk about afterwards. So those who work for the richest people in the world tend to be mum's the word about this kind of information which challenges the official story, which has become a public myth, which supports the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, which supports the threatened liberties that we're suffering with as a result of 9/11. And people have a hard time looking at this or acknowledging it. Politicians, media representatives. We have had a great deal of outreach to politicians, to media representatives, with very little success. Except for a few occasions, like Geraldo Rivera showed Building 7 coming down the World Trade Center a couple of years ago, but nothing happens after that. It's quite interesting what happened. So we've gone directly to the American people. This film is up in its 1-hour version on YouTube. This is the 1.5-hour version. We have other films up on YouTube, like the 15-minute Ed Asner film has been seen 1 million times. We have raised $450,000 to put billboards up all across the United States and around the world, and like the one that was discussed here in San Luis Obispo. And we're slowly, but I think surely, educating the American people as to what really happened here. Ready for the film? Let's begin. Thank you so much for coming.
Speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
My husband Steve was 48 years old when he was killed on September 11, 2001. He was in the North Tower on the 104th floor. There's so many unanswered questions, and that's scary to me. We never had answers. Nobody ever stopped to have a scientific investigation, a scientific investigation, a scientific investigation.
Tribute lights in the New York skyline, an annual memorial to the lives lost on 9/11. Yet there's still more light that needs to shine, revealing truths that their family members deserve to know. September 11th, 2001, a day that changed history. 4 planes went silent and off course. 2 of those planes crashed into the World Trade Center Twin Towers. Several columns were severed, and the jet fuel ignited fires that spread over several floors. About an hour later, millions watched in shock as both towers were suddenly and rapidly destroyed, killing almost 3,000 people, for whom truth and justice may have yet to be served. Hi, I'm Richard Gage, AIA, licensed architect of over 20 years and member of the American Institute of Architects. I'm founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, a non-profit organization of well over 1,000 technical and building professionals. According to official government reports, the fires weakened the structural steel framing of both twin towers, leading to sudden, progressive, and total collapses. Unknown to most people, a third steel frame high-rise, World Trade Center 7, was also destroyed. Critical questions have been raised by more than 1,500 architects and engineers about the official explanations for the destruction of all 3 of these buildings. Along with more than 10,000 other concerned individuals, these professionals, collectively comprising more than 25,000 years of experience, have signed our petition. They're calling for a new investigation into the destruction of these 3 World Trade Center high-rises. This call is based on evidence that reveals a very different destruction scenario than reported by government engineers. This includes abundant scientific forensic data and eyewitness testimony that was omitted from the official reports. You'll be seeing this evidence and hearing from dozens of these technical experts, including many who are among the top in their respective fields.
I claim they're not doing science at all. They're doing propaganda or publicity or whatever they're doing, but it's not science. It's not playing by the rules of science.
We at AE 9/11 Truth take President Obama at his word in his affirmation to the American people during his inauguration. How do we accomplish this? We've done our best by using the scientific method, examining the evidence from the World Trade Center and developing unbiased conclusions from unbiased experts in their fields. As coherent sets of scientific facts are brought into focus by the experts, the data, and the witnesses in this film, you'll come to a much greater understanding of the events of 9/11 and will be in a position to draw your own informed conclusions. Of course, the ones still most affected by the events of that tragic day are the family members of the victims lost on 9/11. Several have asked to appear in this documentary. Although our focus will be primarily technical, we are deeply moved and honored to give them the opportunity to speak directly to you. Now, let's hear from the AE 9/11 Truth professional petition signers, who will share with you what conclusions they came to. Among these experts are high-rise architects and engineers in the fields of structural design, material science, chemistry, fire protection, metallurgy, as well as physicists, explosives experts, and demolition technicians.
If we believe that fires brought down the World Trade Center buildings on 9/11, this is extremely troubling for those of us in the design professions, architects and engineers, even physicists.
Buildings just don't behave like that. There was no hesitation. There was no hesitation when it was to hit, story after story. The tops of the buildings were basically disintegrated.
The fact that it was all reduced to rubble and powder just did not make sense at all.
Our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore. And that's, I think that should frighten all of us.
Also, psychologists, therapists, and counselors, along with theologian David Ray Griffin, who have a deep understanding of the personal issues associated with 9/11, will explain why it is so difficult for us to come to terms with the reality of these events and learn how we can help ourselves and others with this difficult yet vital responsibility.
We were confident, we felt secure, and all of a sudden that security collapsed.
So the question becomes why? Why is it that people have so much trouble hearing this information?
When your beliefs are challenged, fear and anxiety are created.
We don't have leaders who would do those things.
I believe that to be the kind of country that we think we are, we have to face some of the things that are not as we think they are.
We need the truth in order to heal.
Trade Center Building 7 looms above the site of its original. Building 7 was a 47-story high-rise, not hit by an airplane. Yet it was the third modern steel-frame skyscraper to collapse rapidly and symmetrically on 9/11. It was a football field away from the North Tower and sustained minor damage from falling debris. Building 7's precipitous collapse was blamed on normal office fires.
I'm Steve Barish, founder and president of Barish Architects and Associates, Inc., a 33-year-old architecture planning and engineering firm. One of the things that really interested me is how quickly the Tower 7 fell. It fell within 7 seconds approximately from top to bottom. This building was built in the mid-'80s and met all the codes at the time.
From about 1965 until about 1985, most of my experience has been in high-rise, multi-story steel buildings. NIST would have us to believe that these was a typical office fire, scattered office fires, if you will, that brought this building down. Since the mid-'60s, I've tried to follow high-rise fires because they're something we worry a lot about as we design these buildings. And I'm not aware of any high-rise building that have come down as a result of fires.
I first became aware of the problems with the official account of the collapse when I saw a DVD online from Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. They pointed out various problems with the official story, and ones that caught my attention were the rapid failure of the connections in order for the building to come down at the rate that it did.
I've been involved in many large projects, including overseeing several high-rise buildings ranging in size from 14 stories to 40. Over the course of 20 years, I'm mainly called in to help with very large, difficult projects. When I watched Building 7 collapse, it basically left no doubt in my mind that something was wrong. Building 7 had not been hit by a plane.
The coup de grace for me was when I found out that Building 7 had collapsed later that day. And when I saw Building 7 come down, to me, the fact that it looks like a perfect controlled demolition of an intact building, I mean, that's what I call a smoking gun.
Was the structural steel from World Trade Center 7 preserved, documented, analyzed, according to standard procedures for investigating engineering failures?
Hailing the collapse study as an assessment rather than as an investigation has allowed valuable evidence in the form of the tower's structural steel to be destroyed. It is the steel that holds the primary key to understanding the chronology of the events resulting in the collapse.
When did you become aware that the steel from the World Trade Center was being sold off?
I think it was on the order of a week or so before we arrived on site on October the 5th, I believe.
So in other words, the city was selling or was disposing of material within 2 weeks of the actual event?
I believe I was the first one
to find out that the steel is being recycled. New York Times reporter Jim Glass told me 2 weeks after the collapse, and I tried to contact city, and also New York Times reporters tried to make sure we can have access to steel to do the research. It was not happening.
I just think there's so much that has been lost in these last 6 months that we can never go back and retrieve. And it's not only unfortunate, it's borderline criminal.
400 truckloads per day of material were taken away from the World Trade Center site and sent to China for recycling.
There were laws violated in the destruction of that evidence. And for the American Society of Civil Engineers to ignore those events is extremely disturbing and is a violation, in my opinion, of that professional code of ethics.
It was contrary to the way all investigations are done. If an airplane crashes, they seal off the entire area, nobody touches anything, they move it to a secure location, and they reconstruct an aircraft.
Normally, when you have a structural failure, you carefully go through the debris field, looking at each item, photographing every beam as it collapsed and every column where it is in the ground, and you pick them up very carefully and you look at each element. We were unable to do that in the case of Tower 7.
You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science. It's trying to prove preconceived ideas.
Was a proper investigation performed that might have revealed the use of accelerants or explosives in World Trade Center 7's destruction?
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
The American Society of Civil Engineers were brought into this investigation early on. They did a very superficial investigation of the site. They issued a report without any significant forensic examination.
National Fire Protection Association Guide number 921 calls for saving the evidence and being prepared to justify why you wouldn't. It also calls for testing for accelerants and explosives when high order damage is involved. NIST did not do this.
The minimum explosive charge, the 9 pounds, required to fail critical column IE-79 would have produced a pressure wave that would have broken windows in the north and east, resulted in a sound level of 130 to 140 decibels, which is the equivalent sound to a gunshot blast. There were no witness reports of such a loud noise.
There were all kinds of firefighters and civilians that were reporting explosions.
You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when the compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something.
Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor.
Okay, all right? Here, go.
You want to call your mother or something?
Just the fact that there were explosions means they need to be investigated. Terrorists used explosives at the 93. We had witnesses to explosions. We have audio recording of explosions. We have overwhelming evidence that there were some explosive events. The manual gets into thermite, and if it says if you have melted steel or concrete, which we had on 9/11, and there's videos of it, and people can see it, we should test for it. It says when you have melted steel or concrete, you test for thermite. So the fact that they're not testing for it is crazy.
Keep your eye on that building as we come down.
We had 3,000, Americans murdered, and we had the first 3 high-rise and steel collapses. We have all these reports of explosions. We have the history of terrorists using explosives. It's absolutely ridiculous that I mean, there's no excuse for it. It's criminal, in my opinion. The national standards are very clear. We have preservation of evidence, we have spoliation of evidence, there's all kinds of, basically standards that you don't destroy evidence. We don't have the real story on what happened because there wasn't a proper investigation done.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
As reported by the New York Times, engineers were baffled by the collapse of Building 7. Since no steel frame high-rise has ever completely collapsed due to fire, how are we to understand this mysterious event?
High-rise buildings simply do not collapse due to fire. There has never been until 9/11 an experience where a high-rise building that was steel frame completely collapsed. There have been fires burned longer in similar structures without any collapse.
In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In my previous career as a firefighter, normally you'd never be afraid to go into a Type 1 building because they're not combustible, and you would just charge at it and put the fire out. Never in my training were we ever taught that these type of buildings could just collapse in on themselves. There's definitely much more going on than just fire.
The World Trade Center 7 building reminds me of the Meridian Bank building in some ways in Philadelphia. The Meridian Bank building is a 38-story skyscraper that burned for 18 hours in 1991, suffered extensive damage from the fire, but did not collapse.
NIST tells us that this collapse mechanism, starting with thermal expansion, that worked its way upward and outward through the building, in a matter of seconds, there's not enough time for the building to collapse the way that NIST tells us it collapsed.
NIST claims the fires were very large, very hot, and long-lasting, when in reality, observation, which has been researched by many people, shows these fires did not last very long. They were not in the locations where NIST claims they were at given times.
I'm a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. For the 40-plus years that I've been practicing architecture, I've designed a variety of buildings from small houses to high-rise office buildings. Some of the high-rises that I've worked on are 1 shell and 2 shell here in Houston. I was project manager for a 22-story office building in Akron, Ohio. Later in the day, when World Trade Center 7 collapsed, they had already showed us pictures of a few fires in that building, and I mean, they weren't even raging. And how could that cause a building to collapse as if it were imploded? Couldn't happen.
According to lead investigator Sean Sunder of the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, World Trade Center 7 collapsed at free-fall acceleration for more than 100 feet of its fall. What does the speed of the collapse reveal to us?
Essentially, in less than 7 seconds, Tower 7 came down upon itself.
It's just like taking your car keys out and just dropping them. That's how fast the building came down, for over 100 feet. And the only way you can get that is when there's zero resistance. And so what we're looking at is a building just coming straight down, falling right through itself, with zero resistance. Buildings don't have zero resistance, which is why you feel comfortable walking into a building.
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
I've heard people say, well, it came down at free fall or close to free fall and so forth, so I decided to measure it myself. I had a simple tool at the time called Physics Toolkit, which allowed me to take a video and put a dot on each frame to follow the motion of things. And I realized that it's actually coming down at free fall, pretty much dead on the acceleration of gravity. Well, NIST, in their final draft, was saying that the building came down with 40% longer than free fall time.
How can such a publicly visible, easily measurable quantity be set aside?
A free fall time would be an object that has no structural components below it. There was a structural resistance that was provided in this particular case.
He was making our case for us. You can't have free fall when there's support. And in the final report, they modified it and they actually admitted there was a period of free fall involved. But they never changed their model. Like, how do you all of a sudden allow for free fall when they just got done explaining how it couldn't have been in free fall?
NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction.
If floors fall, they tend to fall and are braced by the floor directly beneath it. And there's some delay there.
Because of redundancy, because of all the other columns in the building that were not affected.
Even if a floor were to collapse, it still wouldn't be able to collapse all of the connections simultaneously at the rate that it did without secondary explosions.
We might anticipate that an unevenly damaged building would fall over. Yet, videos of the collapse of Building 7 show a fairly symmetrical fall. How do we make sense of this?
If the buildings had come down by fire, we would have seen a more natural progression of collapse.
And clearly a more asymmetrical pattern should have been present.
The symmetry is the smoking gun. It cannot happen that when you have asymmetric damage, you will get a perfectly symmetrical collapse.
The exterior columns on the outside as well as on the inside, at the bottom would have to be severed almost at the same time.
I worked for Controlled Demolition Incorporated, CDI, the top-rated explosives demolition firm in the world. As an explosives loader, my job was to place explosives in the buildings to prepare them for demolition. I was licensed while in New York by the New York Fire Department to handle explosives. And I worked on major projects such as Seattle Kingdom, the Three River Stadium, Philadelphia Naval Hospital, and Keys Band gas holders in New York. What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it. That's another indicator that this NIST report is very suspect.
When it's all finished, the outside walls are piled one on top of the other right in the middle of the building. Just like a house of cards if it were coming down.
As a structural engineer, I don't believe that the failure of one column would normally bring down an entire building in the way we saw World Trade Center 7 come down.
According to NIST, the failure occurred at column 79 on level 12. This means basically they're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building. That just does not make any sense.
NIST provided computer animations which supported their fire collapse theory. But what do independent engineers say about these animations?
When you observe the footage of how the building failed, and when you look at the animation of the failure, and compare that to what you actually observe in reality. And I think they disproved their own theories.
The exterior of the NIST World Trade Center 7 computer simulation model, which they put together to try to explain their theory, shows large, very large deformations which are not observed in the video of the actual event. If they don't attempt to explain this in the report, what we see on the real video is not a natural collapse.
Some agent that was destroying the connections in building number 7 at 400 connections per second, and the only thing that I can see that would be capable of doing this would be explosive devices at the connections. And this is why I think that there has to be a new investigation to find out the real physical causes for all these members to act in an atypical fashion.
The Freedom of Information Act request to NIST by a registered structural engineer for calculations and analysis was denied by NIST, but the claim that releasing this data might jeopardize public safety. How could it possibly jeopardize public safety to tell people in the industry, engineers who were responsible for designing these buildings, how this failure could occur?
Science is never secret when it's done right. Science is a way of finding out that is self-correcting and involves many people. Science isn't science unless it's published, unless it's openly published and made available for criticism.
The explanations from FEMA and from NIST don't add up. But there is enormous circumstantial evidence, circumstantial and actually physical evidence as well, that would lead us to a different conclusion. And the conclusion is controlled demolition.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Het heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Building 7 to me is really what gives it away. Because that's a classic case of controlled demolition.
This is the original site of the World Trade Center Twin Towers. Construction is now underway where dramatic new facilities are being erected. Just 10 years ago, the planes hit the towers, cutting through some exterior and interior supporting structural steel columns. The fuel from the planes ignited office fires across several floors. According to the official reports, the structural steel frame was weakened and failed, causing a total progressive collapse of each tower. Does the official explanation make sense? Was there a comprehensive investigation that examined all of the evidence?
I walked into the office and the first words that I heard was that planes just run into the World Trade Center. And my initial thought was, well, that's okay. It's built to withstand a 707.
It did not seem possible that these towers that were designed to withstand the impact of a 707 could possibly collapse in such a short order of time from the time that they were hit. They were designed to withstand hurricane force winds of up to 140 miles an hour.
These buildings are built to handle several times the load above them. Those perimeter columns could handle 5 times the load above them, and the core columns could handle 3 times the load above them.
I remember walking up to a window
And a young man turned to me with tears coming down his face, and he said, will they fall down? And I said, no. Never has a steel structured building in the history of steel structured buildings ever fallen down for reasons of fire.
The majority of the jet fuel was burnt up instantly in the big fireball, and it was gone. The fires that were left were office furnishings and carpet and things like that. A lot of things in these kind of buildings have to be fire resistant by nature. It's required by code. So there really isn't a whole lot of fuel in there to begin with.
The media portrayed these fires as being extremely hot, but the fires were not that hot in World Trade Center 1 and 2. If you look at the NIST zone data, you can see this. And to use our own powers of observation, you could tell by seeing these fires and seeing black smoke come out the windows. That means that the fires were oxygen starved, and it was incomplete combustion. And so it was a low temperature fire.
I looked up in the manual the burning temperature of jet fuel and found that under the conditions that existed at the World Trade Center on 9/11, that jet fuel had to have been burning at about 750 degrees Fahrenheit. I also noticed that the official explanation of what happened there was that the heat from the fire supposedly softened the steel and thereby brought the buildings down. If you have a flame at 750 degrees, you can hold that flame under a steel beam forever, and you'll never reach a high enough temperature to bend steel, let alone melt it. So immediately I knew at that point that the official explanation was dead wrong.
Rather than a slow groaning collapse that we might anticipate, the Twin Towers show in the videos a very rapid, sudden onset of destruction. What does this imply?
Structural steel is required by building and design codes to prevent catastrophic failure and loss of public life. Everybody's seen the building collapses on 9/11, and it was shocking how fast the buildings collapsed.
I would not have expected the whole building to just give in at once, and I thought it rather odd that they fell almost perfectly in very similar ways. It seemed odd that lightning would strike twice.
And it certainly would stay in the damage zone. It would not drop down through 80,000 tons of insulated, undamaged structural steel and do it in 12 seconds.
NIST claimed that the upper section of each of the towers crushed the lower section. However, when you watch video closely, in the case of World Trade Center 1, you'll see that the upper section disintegrates itself. It appears to be a controlled demolition of its own, of the upper section.
The top section, pushing on the bottom section, it's going to meet equal forces as it goes. Both sections are going to be demolished at the same rate. So by the time you've crushed up 15 stories below it, the top 15 stories are also going to be crushed. And so there's nothing left now to crush the rest of the building. You're looking for a jolt, that this thing, if it actually comes down and hits, you should be able to see the point at which they actually impact, because it would actually slow down the motion of the falling block.
Before the tower started collapsing from the top, the antenna started to fall. And the antenna, of course, was over the middle of the elevator shafts. I'm very familiar with the interior structure that surrounded the elevator shafts and the accessibility which the elevator companies had 24/7.
It wouldn't be a problem once you gained access to the elevator shafts. Then a team of loading experts would have access to all the core columns and beams. The rest could be accomplished at that point by just the right kind of explosives for the job at hand.
The only way that I can see that the towers could have collapsed is that the interior columns were compromised.
NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, acknowledges that the towers came down at essentially free-fall acceleration. What are the implications of that admission?
The measurements have indicated that Tower 1 collapsed in about 11 seconds and Tower 2 collapsed in about 9 seconds. This is essentially the rate at which free fall would happen.
The buildings actually accelerated as they came down, meaning they were not getting resistance from these massive columns in the center of the core of this building. The core of this building was very heavy. They're huge columns, huge.
This block accelerates straight down. Now, of course, it's picking up speed downward continually. It doesn't slow down, it just continues to gain speed. It accelerates the entire time. And that was what was extremely significant. This structure was capable of holding 3 to 5 times the weight. And here it is falling through it with a resistance of only 1/3 of its weight. Roughly 90% of the resistance has been removed. And what's happening is the top section is not crushing down the lower section like a pile driver, which is the picture that NIST basically is painting. It's actually falling into material that's already been pulverized. It's offering very little resistance. It's just coming down through pre-pulverized material.
Structural connections not only had to fail nearly simultaneously, but in sequential order.
You stood there and watched it destroy itself, wiping out floor by floor all 287 structural columns as if they didn't exist underneath the damage zone.
Over 100 first responders reported sounds of explosions and flashes of light at the onset of destruction of both towers. These were not discussed in the NIST report. What did these eyewitnesses actually see and hear?
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
Inside the lobby.
We stuck on the stairs for a while. We finally got down to the lobby. Then we get to the lobby, it was this big explosion.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that not exploded about an hour later.
Then there were secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
It sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
We heard a very loud blast explosion.
We heard a loud explosion.
At that point, we heard a large boom. You know, I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion. There was another major explosion.
All of a sudden, you hear an explosion, and you can see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom, and you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor, it's popping out.
It was as if they had detonated. They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
It just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go like firecrackers.
they're reporting exactly what I would expect. You're hearing boom, 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 waves of explosions going off, not one massive big boom.
There's so many videos of witnesses from that day that report explosions. There's radio transmissions from the FDNY. We have the transcripts that were recorded, back in 2001 of all these firefighters and first responders reporting explosions.
This testimony should have caused the presumption that there was a good chance explosive residue would be found and justify testing for it, rather than the opposite.
It doesn't look like a collapse. It's like a huge mushrooming, billowing kind of an event. That whole thing looks nothing like a building falling down. It's a building being blown up. That's what the physics shows.
Yet they refuse to consider the possibility that explosives or some other form of demolition device could have been used to cause the collapses of the towers. And the fact that controlled demolition is consistent with all the available technical evidence. And the response to that request for correction is NIST simply saying they're unable to provide a full explanation for the total collapse, even though that was their task given to them by Congress.
FEMA documents a 1,200-foot diameter debris field around each tower. Videos show multi-ton steel sections of hundreds of individual steel pieces ejecting out of the towers at 60 miles an hour for a distance of 600 feet. They also show clouds of debris pulverized in mid-air and isolated explosive ejections as many as 60 stories below the so-called crush zone. Videos also show the near total destruction of both towers. What does all this tell us about the forces and energies involved in the destruction? The spread of debris in a large radius around each tower. What we see is an outward explosion of material beyond the perimeters of each footprint. And this is not expected, and it's not congruent with the reports of our government.
Large multi-ton beams were hurled hundreds of yards laterally. Gravity works vertically, not laterally.
Something's happening to throw these things horizontally at those kinds of speeds. And here it is trailing white smoke the whole time. It really is indicative of some kind of explosion.
The individual explosions that I noticed 20 and 30 and 40 stories below the collapsing structure. And naysayers tend to say, well, that's just air being blown out the windows. I mean, it doesn't really work to say it's just air pressure. Estimated these are coming out faster than 100 miles an hour.
The floors pancaking upon themselves would create gushes of air out the side, but not the kind of explosive force that we saw that would throw I-beams across the street into the windows of other buildings.
The ejection of the materials out of the building, the manner in which it fell, the speed at which it fell, exhibited all the signs of demolitions and the completeness of the destruction down to their individual elements.
When the South Tower was destroyed, at first it looked like it was going to land in the street or take a building out next to it, and then all of a sudden it disappears in this huge cloud of smoke.
There were two substations on the 108th floor, the 75th floor, and the 41st floor, and the 7th floor. At those 8 locations, there were 4 transformers in each substation that weighed over 30,000 pounds. The transformers would not explode on their own. They were air-cooled, dry-type transformers. And yet after the collapse, there was no evidence of them being found at the bottom of the towers. I wonder why.
As an architect, I would expect to see larger portions of the building floors, the decking, the steel decking, the concrete topping, much larger remnants of what the structural components of this building was. After all, there was 110 floors in each building, and each floor plate was over an acre in size.
And there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
In its report on World Trade Center 7, which came out in May of 2002, FEMA documents in Appendix C steel that has been melted and even partially evaporated, resembling Swiss cheese. What are we to make of this?
This was the size of steel that they used in the construction of Tower 7. They didn't use this particular kind of steel in Towers 1 or Towers 2. So that's why we know its pedigree. It was a surprise to me because it was so eroded and deformed, and so we took it for analysis in the lab.
One section of steel was kept. How it got to be in its present state was described by the New York Times as perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation.
There's parts where the entire half-inch of the beam is gone, entirely dissolved right through, and so something happened to cause the steel to really thin and in some places to disappear entirely. Well, it was attacked by what we determined was a liquid slag. When we did the analysis, we actually identified it as a liquid containing iron, sulfur, and oxygen.
I'd like to know why NIST excluded the evidence of melting steel. Well, why is this not included? Why is this forensic evidence not being included in the report?
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, there's no eyewitness who says so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry. Like lava.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat into one single element.
And they pulled out a big block of concrete and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Firemen and lots of people describe flowing molten metal, iron or steel at extremely hot temperatures, and John Gross categorically denied their observations, so that because their observations don't fit his preconceived notion, he not only ignored evidence, he denied evidence.
There were reports of molten steel having been seen in the rubble pile of all three buildings, and I knew that jet fuel, which is essentially kerosene, is not capable of melting steel nor iron. Kerosene or jet fuel burns at less than 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, And molten steel needs at least 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit in order to melt.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel. And yet we have evidence of molten iron in the microspheres, in the rubble pile, and the metal pouring out of the side of the tower.
I worked as in the project engineering department of the casting plant of Elcan, the aluminum company of Canada, one of the largest aluminum smelters on the planet at the time. And in that smelter we turned aluminum oxide into aluminum, molten aluminum. Molten aluminum is silver. It's not yellow, it's silver. It looks like mercury. The yellow molten metal that I saw pouring out of the south tower is indicative of molten iron.
The official explanation of what happened there was that the heat from the fire supposedly softened the steel and thereby brought the buildings down. Well, second law of thermodynamics says, just like water can only flow downhill when it's poured on the ground, similarly heat can only move downhill. But with heat, downhill means from a region of higher temperature to a region of lower temperature. And the heat flowing uphill from a 750 degree flame to a 3,000 degree puddle of molten steel violated the second law of thermodynamics.
The only way that's known that a carbonaceous material can cause steel or iron oxide to turn into a molten metal is in a blast furnace. And that's very different than what we had.
So what is this molten metal? It's a direct evidence for the use of thermite.
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers.
I found a pore in the steel that had pure sulfur embedded in the pore, which I thought was very strange, and so that's when I really started looking for sulfur and finding it in more abundance in some of these phases.
There's a government theory that calcium sulfate from gypsum boards was the source of sulfur, and that's wrong. Calcium sulfate cannot undergo any kind of a chemical reaction that produces the element sulfur, and we're not dealing with any kind of compound of sulfur. When we're talking about sulfidation, we're dealing with the element sulfur.
There's a version of thermite called thermate, which has sulfur in the thermate. And what the sulfur does is it's sort of like salt on ice.
And it just basically makes the steel melt at a lower temperature. And if you do a search on Google for thermite and building demolition, you can find devices that have been fabricated and invented that use thermite for building demolitions.
In the case of thermite cutting charges, you would have heard far less noise since they are worked by thermal heating, melting of the steel, rather than an explosive cutting as in RDX charges.
Overflights had detected with infrared camera 1,400 degree Fahrenheit hotspots on the surface of ground zero, and that being there for a week, indicates that there was something very hot going on below the surface.
So thermite would also explain potentially the fact that the fires could not be put out at ground zero. The fires lasted for quite a while, but most importantly, they were deep within the pile, where people would expect that the environment was oxygen starved. And thermite could explain this because it has its own oxidant within. It's actually the metallic oxide that provides the oxidant to allow the incendiary thermite reaction to occur, even underwater.
As much as 6% of the World Trade Center dust consisted of tiny, previously molten iron spheres. What does this tell us about the temperatures generated in the tower's destruction?
When the USGS collected samples of the World Trade Center dust, they found the iron microspheres. Insofar, the USGS does not have a valid explanation for the presence of these iron microspheres.
So what do the microspheres contain? Iron is the main element, and then it has smaller portions of aluminum, sulfur, a trace of manganese. Most of them are less than about 1/10 of an inch in diameter, and they're spherical. And they're found in all of the dust blown out of the buildings during collapse, no matter where in Manhattan that dust is picked up.
You must have had a much hotter heat source for you to get 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit in order to melt the iron to get these molten spheres. Your heat source must be something like a chemical reaction, an exothermic chemical reaction that reacts, in the case of thermite, reacts at 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit.
My contention, based on finding thermite residue in the dust, is that it happened before. It didn't happen after in the fires that ensued in the rubble pile afterwards. It's all the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved in melting those steel beams.
Out of the ashes of the World Trade Center devastation rises the Freedom Tower, whose foundation, however, is shrouded in question. For example, in the World Trade Center dust, an international team of scientists find an advanced form of highly energetic nanothermite composites. What is it, and where does it come from?
In the dust, we found what we characterize as unreacted thermitic material in the shape of some very tiny red-gray chips. And in the reaction they produce molten iron, which is the prime indication of a thermitic reaction. And such a reaction can be used to destroy steel structures. What we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite, which is produced in a different way. It's not just two powders being mixed. The material is actually built from the atom scale up. We call it bottom-up procedure, which is what you do in nanotechnology. The ingredients are much smaller, which means they're reacting faster and they're more easily ignited.
The primary elements in the red material are aluminum, iron oxide, as well as silicon and carbon. The iron oxide appears in faceted grains, approximately 100 nanometers across. The aluminum appears in thin platelets, about 40 nanometers thick. In ordinary thermite, the particle size is much larger, and hence ordinary thermite is an incendiary. Whereas as the particle size becomes smaller and smaller, superthermite is sometimes called. This red material contains also a significant amount of carbon, and the formulation of nanothermite as described by National Laboratory publications also implies the presence of carbon, very typically. The organic is used with nanothermite in order to produce gas, and that is a very high pressure gas. We do have descriptions from the Livermore National Laboratory in particular of how they fabricated this material, but to fabricate it is not so easy. This is discussed in our paper in the Open Chemical Physics Journal, published in April of 2009. So far, none of these papers have been refuted in the literature, the scientific literature. So that means they are unchallenged in the scientific sense. They stand as an indictment, really, of the official story of 9/11.
One of the things I'd like to stress about these chips is they're not a natural formed agglomeration of aluminum from the aircraft or materials that were in the building and iron oxide that got knocked off. It isn't just a haphazard bringing together of iron oxide and aluminum, which is the basic components of thermite. This is a material that is made up of nano-sized particles that are all very uniform, very symmetrical.
There was actually some significant findings in the residue. After igniting these chips in the DSC, we found microspheres. The significance of the calorimeter cannot be understated here. Many of these spheres had the exact or identical composition or very similar composition as the spheres that Steve was finding in the dust samples. They were also very similar to spheres found in thermite, in commercial thermite. There were no microspheres found in the paint sample that had been ignited in the DSC. We also took paint that came off of the WTC steel and looked at that in the SEM and did a compositional analysis of that and found that it was not similar to the red-gray chip or the red layer of the red-gray chips.
This cannot be paint. Paint does not have these exotic properties. It's impossible. This is material that is of military use that really shouldn't be there.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Any honest investigator would be looking at this and looking for explosives and so forth. NIST investigation didn't go there. They just would not look for explosives. This has been work of independent researchers, not NIST.
So the preconceived notion of NIST is that there's no evidence for explosives, and so there's no point in looking. That is the most unscientific thing that you can possibly think of, not to look because you don't expect to find evidence, and in fact the evidence is overwhelming that these red-gray crystals are very high temperature incendiaries. They state these conclusions for which there's virtually no evidence, and then they ignore conclusions that can be drawn from the evidence.
The physical chemistry of everything that I wrote about is consistent with no other hypothesis. And all of the testimony of eyewitnesses, all of the video evidence supports only controlled demolition as the cause of all three World Trade Center buildings' destruction.
That conclusion I come to based upon, first of all, my training, my education, and particularly my experience in blowing up major structures that had been designed to withstand blasts. The experience that I had gained in the military and as an engineer was irrefutable. I couldn't come to any other conclusion except for the fact that those buildings were brought down by explosives. They fit the profile.
The only way that a building can accelerate as it collapses is by having pre-engineered, precisely timed, and precisely placed explosives. In other words, controlled demolition.
We have a professional responsibility, and I urge every engineer and architect and demolitions expert and anybody that has any knowledge in this field to examine the evidence and stand up and be counted, because the rest of the world is dependent upon us.
We know we've been lied to about 9/11. We don't know for sure who did it. We don't know exactly how they did everything. And that's why we need a new investigation to find out. We do know that there was a massive cover-up, that there was evidence hidden and destroyed, The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
Some kind of consciousness raising on my part before I was willing to look at the possibilities. And really, you need to go where the evidence leads.
Let's look at it objectively. Let's look at the evidence, not these fabricated computer models and hearsay and all these predetermined conclusions. Let's really open it up again and investigate this thing properly, and then come to conclusions.
I strongly support an independent investigation that would be independent of the government, independent of all of the influences that obviously were in effect during the NIST investigation.
We need to have an investigation of NIST themselves. I believe that the reports that came out are not true. I believe there's a lot of information that was omitted, blatantly or otherwise.
We need the truth because our nation has invested so much in the official story of 9/11 and in terms of what we have assumed that has happened, and we really can't go down the same road without knowing what actually happened.
What happened on 9/11 is not something that is just going to go away. This is very pertinent to us today. I wish to further the investigation, and I want to make a difference because I want this to be a safe and better place for my children.
I signed the petition on the Architect and Engineers 9/11 Truth website, mainly because I wanted to stand behind the families that lost people on 9/11. The 9/11 Truth movement was started by the families that lost loved ones on that day, and they were all out there alone, screaming for help, and our own country was ignoring them, ignoring their needs and not taking care of them the way we should have after that happened.
Most of us who have lived with the events of 9/11 have, as a result, experienced some kind of trauma. It can be very difficult to come to terms with what actually happened at the World Trade Center. In fact, someone told me recently, "I wouldn't believe what you're telling me even if it were true." Our petition signers with psychological expertise have stepped forward to offer their insight. While this segment is clearly outside the knowledge base of the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, these experts in psychology highlight their valuable experience for us as to why this evidence can still be so difficult for people to accept.
As we know, the horrors of what happened on 9/11 were televised all over the world, and they were televised, in fact, live. We witnessed the deaths of almost 3,000 of our fellow Americans. We know this had a very severe and traumatic impact on a large majority of the population. At this point, we have 9 years of hard scientific evidence that disproves the government theory about what happened on September 11th, and yet people continue to be either oblivious to the fact that this information exists or completely resistant to looking at this information. So the question becomes why? Why is it that people have so much trouble hearing this information? From my work, I think we would be remiss not to look at the impact of trauma.
Many people respond to these truths in a very deep way. Some have a visceral reaction like they've been punched in the stomach. To begin to accept the possibility that the government was involved is like opening Pandora's box. If you open the lid and peek in a little bit, it's going to challenge some of your fundamental beliefs about the world.
If we can think of our worldview as being sort of our mental and emotional home, I think all of us will do just about anything to defend our homes, to defend our families. And so I see that with people, and I saw that with myself when my brother tried to talk with me about it. of don't mess with me, don't mess with my home, don't mess with my comfort with how things are. About a week later, I read a lengthy article by Professor Griffin about why he believes the official account of 9/11 cannot be true. And it was a very well-researched article. It was in my office at the time. I sat there and I felt my stomach churning. I thought maybe I was going to be sick. And I leaped out of my chair and ran out the door and took a long walk around the block, around several blocks, and just broke down. I understand now that what was happening was my worldview about my government being in some way my protector, almost like a parent, had been dashed, and it was like being cast out into the wilderness, I think is the closest way to describe that feeling. And I sobbed, felt like the ground had completely disappeared beneath my feet, and I knew at some point during the walk that I knew that I was going to have to become active in educating other people about this, that for me to retain any sense of integrity, I was going to have to take some action. I couldn't just let something like this go.
When we hear information that contradicts our worldview, social psychologists call the resulting insecurity cognitive dissonance. For example, with 9/11, we have one cognition, which is what the official story of 9/11, what our government told us, what our media repeated to us over and over, that 19 Muslims attacked us. On the other hand, we have what scientists, researchers, architects, engineers are now beginning to tell us, which is that there is evidence that shows that the official story cannot be true. So now we've lost our sense of security. We are starting to feel vulnerable. Now we're confused.
9/11 truth challenges the beliefs that our country protects us and keeps us safe, and that America is the good guy. When your beliefs are challenged, fear and anxiety are created. In response to that, our psychological defenses kick in, and they protect us from these emotions. Denial, which is probably the most primitive psychological defense, is the one most likely to kick in when our beliefs are challenged.
And it's a very, very uncomfortable state to be in. And eventually our mind shuts off. Just like when a computer is overloaded, our minds get overloaded. We can't handle it anymore and we shut down.
And what some of us will tend to do is deny the evidence that's coming our way and stick to the original story, the official story, and to try to regain our equilibrium in that way. Another thing we can do is decide to look at the conflicting evidence and be sincere and be open-minded and look at both sides of the issue and then make up our own mind about what reality is. Here are a few of those spontaneous initial reactions to hearing the contradictory evidence about 9/11.
I don't want to know the truth, or I'd become too negative and psychologically go downhill. I'm not sure I want to know. If this is true, then up would be down, and down would be up. My life would never be the same.
They say, this is the way the world works, and I'm convinced this is the right way the world works. 9/11 doesn't fit into that paradigm. So I don't need to look at the evidence.
Fran, I refuse to believe that many Americans could be that satanically treasonous. Someone would have talked. But these are beliefs. They are not scientific facts. But these beliefs do keep us from looking at the empirical evidence. Whenever we say, I refuse to believe, we can be sure that the evidence that's coming our way is not bearable and that it's conflicting with our worldview much too much. As I thought about all of these responses, I realized that what is common to every one of them is the emotion of fear. People are afraid of being ostracized, they're afraid of being alienated, they're afraid of being shunned, they're afraid of their lives being inconvenienced, they have to change their lives, they're afraid of being confused, they're afraid of psychological deterioration, They're afraid of feeling helpless and vulnerable. And they're afraid that they won't be able to handle the feelings that are coming up. None of us want to feel helpless and vulnerable.
Healing comes through facing the truth, experiencing it, allowing the feelings to come in, so that if there are feelings of fear that perhaps these events were caused by something we haven't thought about yet, dark elements within our society, for example, we'll let that come in and explore it. Let the light shine on whatever happened. This will be the most healing process. The Germans did this after their war. The South Africans did this after apartheid. Reconciliation through the truth is what is a deep path to psychological recovery from the myths and lies around which this historic event has been cloaked in the official view.
One of the ways to deal with the trauma is to find the answers. That's why I think it is of such importance to have a comprehensive investigation.
To work together to expose what happened, regardless of where the evidence takes us. That's what we expect in our state government, law enforcement. I think that by putting science together with the law, we will have a psychological healing around the impossible cognition that has been produced on that day.
After World War II, part of the way that Jewish people honored the dead was by making sure that the truth was known and that the value of these people was respected. Not pursuing the truth about 9/11 disrespects the value of the life of the people that died. Thinking that we're above such things, that it could happen in other countries, but it couldn't happen here, that's a lack of humility, and that's excessive pride. And so not being able to see our dark side or our weaknesses is the most dangerous thing.
A feature of American history that makes us particularly liable to this pride is this notion that it's called exceptionalism, that America is the exceptional nation. And that began from the beginning as this country was formed. People would say, well, there was so much evil in the European countries, so much cheating, so much lying, so much using the people for the rulers' purposes, but not in America. We have leaders that are free from those sins. So I think this has made 9/11 particularly difficult for Americans.
So we need to understand that questioning is patriotic. Questioning is what we're supposed to do as citizens. That's our duty.
When something like 9/11 happens, we need to be sure that we have a real investigation into who the perpetrators are, and then we need to be sure that those perpetrators are held legally accountable. It's part of the healing process on the individual level as on the collective level. We need the truth in order to heal.
Right outside the Philadelphia area, and I'm the father of Bobby McElvain, who was killed in the lobby of the North Tower on September 11, 2001. He was one of the first 10 bodies found. We took him home that week. We were one of the few. I finally found a doctor who examined him. All his injuries were in the face, the front of his face was blown off, massive cuts in his chest, and his right arm were blown off. To me, that means explosion.
What happened on September 11th was the tragedy, where Neil was on Flight 175 and it crashed into the second tower. And I can't imagine what happened to him.
So my brother was my best friend. David has always been a firefighter. My brother went in to save people's lives. I'm a family member trying to find out the answers to the murder of 3,000 plus people.
I'm Jane Policino. My husband Steve was 48 years old when he was killed on September 11th. I have no identification. You know, why is that? It seems to me we should know why over 1,000 victims there are no trace for, and no identification, no trace of over 1,000 victims.
Just a few years ago, they were still finding body parts on the roofs of buildings. What is that?
We should know why there are over 700 bone fragments found on the top of Deutsche Bank building less than a half an inch long. We should have that information. Why were they up there? Why weren't they found? What kind of explosion was there?
And the explosions were brought up many a times, talking to firemen, talking to medics, talking to everyone. Everybody talked about these explosions.
I want the officials that are in power to ask the questions. I want answers.
Please look at architects and engineers. People all around the world, scientists, all around the world are questioning this. When you bring science into the equation, that's so important because you can't argue against science. And there's some deep, deep explaining to do.
The bottom line is that it needs to be investigated properly.
We will never heal. This country will never, ever, ever forget that day. We have to demand a new investigation. I want justice here.
The forensic evidence that you've seen is very real. New light has been shown. A third beam now reaches into the pitch black sky and stands in for the still officially unexplained free-fall destruction of the World Trade Center Building 7. The obvious dark truth about Building 7 may very well provide the key to justice for the victims of family members of the destruction of the Twin Towers.
The country owns this. We were all victims. And you all should want answers. It's not just ours, not just mine. We all lost something that day.
You were in the video, I remember.
Pardon me?
Do I remember you from in the video?
Yes, I am in this video.
I was wondering what your background was and how you got involved.
How did this involve? My involvement in AE 9/11 Truth started about 4 or 5 years ago. A friend of mine has sent me a video of, I guess it was Building 7. He said, "What do you think?" And I spent days searching around for videos of various things and came across AE 9/11 Truth in the process. Read through their literature, did a little research, talked to some friends of mine who I saw had previously signed the petition. I then signed, and something I should tell you that most people aren't aware of, we now have 2,100 architects and engineers who have signed the petition. every architect and engineer is vetted. We make sure that they are who they are and that they are in fact licensed before we admit that they're a member. And as a part of that process, they look into what your background is. And I have done tall buildings, and when they were combing through the signatures to put together the movie Experts Speak Out and look for people to sign, to speak, they contacted me and did an interview. And that's how I got involved.
Now, for your members, you screen them? Has there actually been somebody pretending to be?
Yes. People, yeah, we got Mickey Mouse, we got Osama bin Laden signing up as an engineer. And so that's obviously one of the reasons we need to verify them. We also want to make sure they really do have a degree. We will make sure that that degree is real. Not all architects or engineers are licensed, but they all have degrees. A little louder for you.
As a follow-up to his question, do you ever have someone who's trying to undermine what you're doing, like a mole or something, trying to become a member?
Well, in our organization, there are people with personality issues that come and go, and some of them are still with us. I don't have suspicions that there's actually been moles, if you will. There's plenty of proof of that in other organizations, though.
What about the Dr. Judy, I can't remember that name.
It would.
She's got some interesting stuff that she's doing. I don't necessarily...
Yeah, let me address that. That's a good question. There are many theories as to what happened to these towers other than explosives and incendiaries being placed in them. So what you'll see here today is scientific forensic evidence for explosives. There are theories about that those explosives were nuclear weapons. Well, there's no evidence to suggest that. And some people suggest that there is, because there's a little bit of background, there's a little bit of radiation that exceeds backgrounds. Not nearly enough, not even enough to be, are we ready?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, hold on. To evidence nuclear weapons, Dr. Judy Wood suggests an exotic type of directed energy weapon, for which she also cites no evidence, but she believes that it explains some of the unusual phenomena found. But in the process, she actually denies that there's evidence of explosions, which you're going to see plenty of here. She denies that there's evidence of thermite and incendiary, which you're going to see plenty of evidence tonight. And she denies that there's evidence of very hot, molten, liquid iron or steel, which you're going to see plenty of evidence for. So anybody who denies the basic scientific forensic evidence, and let me know if you have any questions about that evidence today. I have, but I don't have questions about it. I don't have questions that it exists. So I question her integrity. And so maybe you can draw your own conclusions about the evidence after we watch it. Let's go. But let me ask you, I asked you those 3 questions before we started the film. How many of us believe the official story that jet planes and fires brought these towers down? How many of us are unsure? How many of us agree with the evidence for explosive controlled demolition at this point? How many believe that the towers came down according to the official story? We had 2 before. Not 2? Is anybody still unsure? You might still be unsure. 1, 2, 3, thank you. And how many think the towers came down by explosive demolition now? Okay, do you think we have a discussion here? An important one? Okay, so I do want to answer your questions. First, I want to give you an opportunity to sign up for our free monthly email newsletter. We'll give you the latest evidence that's coming in, our next effort toward a real investigation, actions which we're coordinating across all communities like San Luis Obispo. So I have 2 clipboards, and we'll start one on each side. Our faithful volunteer Vincent will hand those to this gentleman and this lady over here. And If you could make sure those make it all the way to the back, that would be fantastic. The other thing I want to invite you to do is support AE 9/11 Truth. Some of you supported us on the way in, that's great. Others came in late. I'll give you an opportunity to support us as well. Still others of you recognize that we have a critically important role in reshaping society, in correcting some of the wrongs. After all, the truth about what happened at 9/11 starts a domino chain of events, of awarenesses about other injustices that have been, are being, and yet to be perpetrated against the American people. And we believe, which is the reason we're out here 24/7 pushing the truth about 9/11, educating the American people, outreaching to media representatives and architects, engineers, and government officials, is because that is the issue that really starts the chain of dominoes to unfold in the overall truth movement. So, Vincent, if you would help me again, this is the opportunity for you to open your wallet and put everything in. No, I'm just kidding. If you can help us, here's one for this side. Russ, thank you. Just pass the box on. And thank you, Vincent. And so let's see if there's any questions that come up. Lots of questions. We don't have a microphone though, do we, Matt? For
no,
the
no part.
So we'll ask you to stand up and belt it out so everybody can hear your question. Yes, ma'am.
Soon after the two twins of May Towers came down, it's 7. What was the timing?
Building 7 came down that afternoon. The Twin Towers came down in the morning. About 7 hours later, the Building 7 drops like you saw it. Robert, I'm wondering if you'd like to help me answer some of these questions. I'm sure some of them are going to be over my head. And Matt, do we have a stool calling for a real investigation, right? And Ron Paul has made some efforts, not a whole lot. Jim Himes of Connecticut actually wrote NIST and said, hey, what about this thermite? And they wrote him and said, well, go back to sleep, Mr. Congressman. This is just beer cans and rust mixing in the air, forming this highly sophisticated nanothermite composite explosive that's made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. I'm being facetious, obviously, but no, that we've had very little help from government officials. Do you want to take a stab at that one too? Have you had any support from government officials? Robert's on our board of directors, and we're constantly going after these individuals. Most recently, we put a billboard that's 40 feet tall, or 30 feet tall, right in front of the New York Times. And we've written their board of editors and said, oh, it says, New York Times, when will you cover this? 2,000 architects and engineers cite evidence for controlled demolition at Building 7. So, no response yet. Question, yes. Can you stand up for us? Yeah.
I've got 2 questions about number 7. What is, in your opinion, what is the motive for bringing it down? And has anybody ever been brought to task for removing and scrapping the evidence?
Well, nobody's been brought to task for the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. I can assure you of that. As far as the first question, you want to take a stab at that one?
The motive behind why any of this happened has really not been examined yet. There are a number of very well done documentaries out there by other people who have examined a number of the motives, and they're pretty compelling. Our group has stayed primarily with the forensic evidence. The forensic evidence of what actually happened, what caused those buildings to come down, as opposed to the motive behind it. Is that okay?
Yeah. And what we do need is an investigation that will look at what are the motives. Well, what happened after 9/11? We had the invasion of 2 countries. The invasion of Afghanistan, was that to bring Osama bin Laden to task? No. That didn't happen for 13 years, and some say it didn't happen at all. But the production of opium skyrocketed under U.S. control over there. There are many researchers who suspect that may have been a motive. After all, the Taliban shut down the opium production in Afghanistan to virtually zero, and it is skyrocketed. Well, and they produced 90% of the world's supply of this very valuable material. Who's benefiting? In Iraq, did we go after Iraq because they had ties to Saddam Hussein? I mean, Saddam Hussein had ties to Osama bin Laden? Was there weapons of mass destruction? Most people know why we're in Iraq. So as far as motive goes, going to war is a very difficult thing for Americans. They have to be psychologically terrorized, such as Pearl Harbor, and they have to be manipulated and lied to, and which appears to have been what was done. We've also lost many of our civil liberties, as you saw in the opening of the film, through the National Defense Authorization Act, the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, which any of us today can be arrested, held without a right to a trial or jury, even tortured, even assassinated legally, according to these new statutes. So many who have researched this find that we're entering what is the early phases of a police state. So they're very concerned that the truth movement get on its act to awaken the American people. It's not dissimilar. In fact, the Enabling Act, which gave Hitler the massive powers that he used, was virtually identical to the Patriot Act, which was passed a couple of days after 9/11. Could not have been written in that time. Must have been written before 9/11. That should frighten all of us. Other questions? Yes.
Mine will be a little longer. I think you've been here and maybe have been interviewed by Dave Congleton, he's our only local talk show.
Wait, there's an answer to that question first. Anybody want to address that issue, Matt?
I don't think you've been on Dave Congleton. We tried to get you on there.
That's what I was getting at.
No,
what did he say?
We didn't get a response about
it. He thinks this is all bunk.
He thinks it's bunk. Okay.
That's why I bring him up, because he's more known in this town. Steve Barish, he's the only local guy in the film. But two things about that.
Yes, Steve Barish was one of the high-rise architects you saw in the film from here in San Luis Obispo.
Dave is a lazy broadcaster. I know he's beloved. I'm sorry he doesn't research anything. He doesn't know what he's talking about. I've been on there 100 times. I am San Luis Bill. He got rid of me because I told the truth about it. But two things about that. Whenever there's a conspiracy item brought up, and its timing of being here near the Kennedy anniversary is fascinating to me because they're both very, very similar. But two things he does whenever this topic comes up. It was all debunked by popular mechanics. And number two, people, it's a cottage industry from these conspiracies. And people like you, what this is all about is writing books and making a living out of going around and making these speeches. So number one, I'd like a quick response to popular mechanics, that citadel of research. And secondly, how much do you make a year? And what about this criticism that you're just in this to make a living?
Thank you. I do make about 2/3 of what I used to make as an architect, so I didn't get in this for the profit, I can assure you. I rent a room from AE 9/11 Truth where the headquarters are, and the house, the small 1,200 square foot house, is completely taken over, almost, except for the little room I'm in, by the activities of AE 9/11 Truth. So my life has been given up, taken over by this activity for the last 7 years, full-time for the last 3.5 years. We are constantly looking for assistance just to survive, to pay my salary, my secretary's salary, so that we can get the word out there. And what's our financial condition? Would you add to that, Rob?
Well, as a board member, I'm privy to the finances, and if we have more than 30 days operating cash in the bank, we think we're doing very, very well. So it's extremely important that we find supporters for this movement, for this organization. I'd like to add one more thing. I know who most of those experts are that were in the movie, and I don't know of any of us who take any remuneration whatsoever for any part of what we're doing here. And this takes a significant amount of our time. I couldn't do this if I were still working. I'm retired, and I believe that most of the people on the board who are in fact involved to the degree that I am are exactly the same way. They could not do it based upon if they were still working. It's just too big a task, and there's just too much going on.
And what about popular mechanics?
Oh, the popular mechanics issue, there has been an extensive review written about an analysis of the popular mechanics debunking book and articles and whatever. They're posted on our website. They run through each and every one of their reasons for why we're conspiracy nutheads or whatever, and take them apart from a scientific standpoint. So it has been debunked by us and by many others. This is not rocket science at this point, as some of these guys said in the movies. We're talking about hard physics here. One of the points that I'd like to make, we talked a bit about and the movie talks a bit about the size of the steel in the buildings. Towers 1 and 2, the core columns. Just begin to put this get this in your mind. The core columns down in the lower levels of the building are made up of 3 layers of steel. They're about 24 inches wide by 60 inches long. The 3 layers of steel run the 60-inch direction. The 2 outside layers are 7 inches thick. The inside layer is 5 inches thick, and the cap on the ends is 7 inches thick. They're almost solid steel. And when you looked at that debris field, those columns didn't appear. They were gone. And those columns were that size, up 100, 200 feet into the air. How did that happen? You know, these are the kinds of things that some of us who know how these buildings are built say, that just can't happen, no matter what you say. They didn't bend over, they were just gone.
What does that mean?
Oh, well, I'd like to make a comment. I'm an engineer. Oh, a little louder? Sure. I'm an engineer, not licensed. And I've spent a lot of time, sifting through the evidence. So I'm not just talking off the top of my head here. The only problem when you say, well, look at the size of these columns, we have no sense of how much potential energy was up above those columns. And I don't, since none of us have actually seen a building fall down, it's very, very hard to say whether columns would be remaining or not. It's just, yes, they're huge, but the loads are incredible. So it's very, very hard to go, oh, well, it's obvious it would, it should be there. I just don't know.
Let me address that. Due to the way the building codes are written and the way these buildings are designed and engineered, the load carrying capacity of the columns are probably 5 or 6 times what it would take what you would think it would take, or what can be calculated it would take to deform the columns in the first place. The steel itself, those columns at the base were A54 steel, which is a very high-strength steel. It was new at the time and very difficult to work with, but it's very strong, much stronger than your normal everyday garden variety steel, which is A33 or A36. So you take that design strength of the steel as is measured in a lab by bending and stretching and pulling and compressing and whatever, and you cut it by 1/3. And then you cut it by another 20%. in the design calculations themselves. And then you add to that the live load that is accumulated over the entire height of the building, as if it were all there. And it's not. And so when I talk about how the building, the columns are over-designed, they are substantially over-designed, as are the beams, as are the girders.
Have we ever seen a controlled demolition where the columns were pulverized, or when you have a controlled demolition, do you always have, you know, girders and columns remaining? I just don't have experience, you know, in my everyday world with buildings falling down, and I just know that there is a huge amount of energy being released there. We have all that weight up, you know, so high in the air. So I just don't know. But maybe in looking at other controlled demolitions, do you see that the columns, even when it is a demolition, the columns remain?
Yeah, they remain because what you've done is sliced the columns at various places, at an angle usually, which allows them to be preserved. Not preserved, but they fall over. So then they're removed and put on trucks and taken out. In this case, what Robert's referring to when he says the columns are gone is that many of them sustained, as you saw in the movie, severe melting. Because instead of high-energy explosives, which destroy columns by force and gas expansion, thermite and incendiary destroys them by melting. So some of them actually melted, as you saw, or were highly corroded. Most of them, in terms of being gone, they were distributed laterally in a 1,400-foot diameter outside the perimeter of each of these towers. So that's the substantial reason for their distribution.
Yeah. Well, yes, when I said they were gone, what I really meant was that they should have been standing where they were originally, and they weren't.
Well, there were some little bits and pieces kind of pointing up in the sky.
There were some.
Yeah.
98% of the structure is shattered, one structural member from another, in this case, and in these three cases. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, I know your movie showed about the 700-degree temperature of jet fuel. I know it explained about the heat up to 1,400 degrees, and then 2,700 degrees it bent steel and melted, 4,000 degrees with incendiary devices. I'm from New York. I was in the World Trade Center many times. I've been in that building. Thing is, I didn't see no military jets anywhere in that area. There's military bases all over New York. There was nobody flying in that airspace anywhere that the Trade Center got attacked, Washington got attacked. It all was happening. It seemed odd. The whole military was asleep.
In fact, they had drills, Vigilant Guardian and other drills that took those jets in all different locations and put fake jets on radar for the drills, and so they didn't know, the flight controllers, what was real versus what was happening. They were confused on purpose. And this is researched very well by David Ray Griffin. Yes? Could you stand up for us?
Well, it just seems to me when I'm looking at something like that, it seems like you have the military that would understand all about how to blow up a building, that they're in that business, they know how to destroy things. You have all these different parts of the military that are up asleep, and everything is orchestrated. This is kind of like choreographed, kind of something that came out of Hollywood, that somebody may have spoken to an engineer or an architect down there, and somebody said, let's see how we can cover this whole thing up and make it look really interesting. And then everybody will get so damn confused, they won't know if they're coming or going. And I think that's how they were putting this whole thing together. They don't want you to really know what's going on.
And nobody lost their job during the awareness of all of this, what they called incompetence. In fact, most people were promoted. Very interesting. Yes, sir, could you stand?
A couple of things. There's a book out called Bamboozled, and I don't own it or get anything from it. I bought a small book. And it goes into the flights that day. The main point of that book is written from an airline commercial pilot, I don't know, 10, 20, 30,000 hours in the air. And he goes into how these terrorists with 3 months of flight training couldn't have made these flights. Really interesting to read.
The author of Bamboozled, anybody know his name offhand? He was murdered in his house about a year ago or less. Yeah, they called it a suicide. He apparently killed his 2 kids and his dog, and then himself. I think he was right-handed, and yet the bullet went into this side of his head. So one needs to be very careful about exposing information which those in power are not wanting to be exposed. I haven't had any problems. I'm very grateful. Have you had any problems? No.
To add to that, one of the people who was in the movie, a black gentleman, as he was walking over, Barry Jensen, was interviewed more extensively shortly after the interview that is in the film. And shortly after that, he died under very mysterious circumstances that have never been explained or investigated. So there are people out there who don't want anyone to talk about what really happened, who are in a position to know something.
So the question that people like me have to ask, and Robert, is what is the price we have to pay to keep our silence? And for me, it's unconscionable that we can have this level of information being kept from the American people, and architects and engineers who were aware of the information. It relates to buildings. How can you not start Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth when there wasn't one out there 7 years ago? There's no other choice. I mean, I would much rather die speaking the truth than live in a police state. That's the stand I take. I hope all of you will join me. And yet, most people do not suffer problems as a result of this. We're highlighting 2 exceptional cases. And in the case of the author of Bamboozled, he was writing another book, which was leading, according to many people who have looked at this, leading the research into the planes that were used for the hijackings and where they came from in a particular airfield, and kind of putting it more in their faces than some of the rest of us do. Yes.
Have you tried to get on the Coast to Coast radio show?
Yeah, I've been on the Coast to Coast radio show a couple of times.
Okay.
On Alex Jones 4 or 5 times, and other stations. Yes, sir.
Do you allege that the government was involved in carrying out the attacks?
We try very carefully not to allege who did it or why. We really our focus really is to find the evidence, help assist wherever possible, if possible, those who have developed the evidence, and to disseminate it, get it out in the hands of the public. We are moving in a couple of directions to bring some legal action against some of the people who issued the reports. But we are not in a position, nor do we want to be in a position, of advocating or suggesting who might have done this at this point.
Why would there be a cover-up if the government was not involved?
Well, you know, when I first came into this movement, I actually would say to people when they would ask me that question, actually, I can argue in favor of the official conspiracy theory if you want. I mean, Osama bin Laden was from a construction company, construction family, one of the largest construction families in Saudi Arabia. He, as a contractor, had built extensive, had done extensive work with explosives. He had the wherewithal, the knowledge, the technical expertise to have done this. Did he do it? He said he didn't. But I don't know anymore.
He did say he didn't do it, by the way. That is true.
December 16th, a tape came out, and he says, if you want to know who did this, look at the shadow government in the United States who wants to make this century a century of conflict between Islam and Christianity. This was after the so-called confession tape, videotape came out, in which we saw a fat man sitting in a corner saying, oh yeah, one of the parties didn't know what the other was doing, and all of that. Most people who've looked at those photos agree that it's not Osama bin Laden whatsoever. Over here.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of rumors and around, you know, I don't know which are true, but I was told that not only was the 9/11 used for the support of the war in the Middle East, but even more to break the financial crisis in 2008 to get rid of the middle class. I don't know if that's believable, but that's one rumors I heard about. One bit. See if you know anything about that.
That's a huge motivation. There are those researchers, such as Alex Jones. What?
No, I'm sorry.
Do you want to answer the question? Because this is a tough one, and I'm just going to sidestep it altogether, but I thought I'd do it in a fancy way. He wouldn't figure out what I was doing. Go ahead.
No, I just said I think the middle class is already gone, so he didn't have to worry about that one.
The middle class is already gone. Yeah, well, there are those who suggest that there are movements in the society to actually destroy the middle class, not just figuratively or economically, but through attacks on our health and our well-being. So I'm not going to comment on that one, though. I'm an architect. I'm already in hot water, as Robert's going to talk to me later about some of the things I've said here. Yes, sir?
Yeah, coming back to Building 7, who actually was the tenants of that building? Pardon me?
Tenants of Building 7.
Well, there were a lot of very interesting tenants in Building 7. The FBI was there. The city of New York had just finished a state-of-the-art emergency command center for the city of New York, and they did not occupy it that day. There was the Justice Department, the State Department had offices in that building. The building, by the time it came down, was empty. And they had gone through it very carefully to make certain that there was no one in it. But I don't have the full list, I'm just remembering a few off the top of my head, but there were those type of tenants that were in Building 7.
It was indeed one of the most highly secure buildings outside the Pentagon, with this, the IRS, the Department of Defense, the CIA, the FBI was in it. It would have required mass...
It just occurred to me, one of the things that was in that building that was destroyed was all the evidence for the Enron case. Yeah. Among other things.
Enron and WorldCom were being investigated from the 12th floor, where the worst fires were in this building, which was the floor that suffered, according to NIST, the fatal catastrophic collapse. So those fires need to be investigated, their cause. Yes, sir, in the back?
Yeah, when you talk about thermite, who has access to get thermite? Who can really actually procure it, pick it up? Who can actually get it?
There's different kinds of thermite. Thermite is available actually on eBay. It's just rust and aluminum powder. This particular thermite was extremely advanced, called nanothermite.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, there are only a few, and maybe one or two, very advanced defense contractors, like SAIC, one of whose people was brought in to guide the investigation. So we're looking at the wolves in charge of the hen house.
So the only ones that have access basically to nanothermite is the military, is what you just said, right?
And they're contractors.
That's it. So there it is. So it's pointing right to it.
We certainly want an investigation of those. Investigation of Ace Elevator, who had the contract to modernize the elevator systems in these two buildings the 9 months prior to 9/11, which would have given them every bit of access they need to place these highly sophisticated incendiaries in the columns and beams in those buildings. Yes, sir.
You know, I saw your presentation at Cal Poly, it was a few years ago, and you talked a little bit about Building 7, and I think they wanted to demolish it. You had some section in a video that I saw.
As far as a motive to bring Building 7 down, I've never speculated on that. I mean, it did have an investigation going on for WorldCom, Enron, and others. That's the only speculation I've ever suggested, but it's just that, speculation.
Wasn't there some video of somebody saying that they wanted them to demolish Onset building?
Oh, excuse me, that's different. The owner of the complex, Larry Silverstein and company, owned Building 7. Lessee.
Yeah.
Oh, he never owned it.
He didn't own it.
Well, he owned Building 7, but not the rest of it.
Oh, that could be.
He secured, yeah, he secured a 99-year lease on the rest of the World Trade Center just 6 weeks prior to 9/11, which is fascinating, but all kinds of insurance on the rest of it, and made out like a bandit, of course. He, a year later, said publicly on PBS, America Rebuilds, there's been such terrible loss of life. I was talking to the fire commander. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And so they gave the order to pull, and we watched the building come down. Many people see that as an admission that they destroyed the building on purpose. He says, oh no, I meant pull the firemen out of the building. Well, the firemen were not allowed in the building to fight the fires. They were told not to fight the fires. They were told that it had structural damage. They were told to move back. And that's when you saw Kevin McPadden pulled back 6 blocks away, listening to the radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker, which says, where he's hearing 3, 2, 1, and then those explosions that you heard him talking about in the film happen. And so there's a lot of this kind of evidence. It's pretty interesting. Yes, ma'am?
Has it been calculated what the cost would have been to set up demolition of those 3 buildings to the perpetrators?
I haven't calculated that.
The way that most tall steel frame buildings are demolished, in my experience, has always been by taking them apart piece by piece. We don't do it, usually, until the building clearly is well beyond its salvageable, useful life. They usually have to be 100 years old in that neighborhood before it becomes cost effective. We do know about 1 and 2 that the asbestos removal problems far exceeded the cost of the value of the buildings, just the asbestos removal, and that was not done. They were contemplating it. They had done a little bit, but not much. You see, the fireproofing that was in these buildings, the fireproofing we had available to us in the mid-60s had a slight amount of asbestos in it. The EPA, in their infinite wisdom, has dropped the amount of asbestos that's permissible in fireproofing now. And those 2 buildings, 1 and 2, were owned by the Port Authority, public buildings, in essence, a public entity, and they were under the gun to remove the asbestos, and that was a very big motivating factor. It could be a motivating factor, let me put it that way. I can also comment on something else about those 2 buildings. I was designing a building in San Francisco at the same time, and one of the things that we discovered during the design of our building and talking with them about and corresponding with them about the design of those buildings, and has since proven true, and that is that building 1 and 2 were always very difficult to lease. They had very short floor-to-floor heights, and they were always very difficult to lease and bring in full income stream to amortize the cost. So that was another factor that really hasn't come out very much, but it weighed heavily on the actual viability of those 1 and 2. Building 7 is a conventional frame with a typical floor-to-floor heights, and it was not that, it didn't have that problem.
What I was thinking was putting all those devices in that actually made for the demolition. What would those devices alone cost? And manpower and the use of the devices that demolished it, what would that alone cost?
Oh, the cost to actually blow them up.
And then on top of that.
Well, when we do demolish buildings by explosives, it's not a particularly expensive thing to do. It's generally much less expensive than taking them down piece by piece. The buildings that you saw brought in the video and that we are generally bring down by controlled demolition are generally concrete frame buildings. We do some steel, but generally they're concrete frame, which are much easier to bring down by controlled demolition.
And I have no idea the cost.
Well, the cost is significantly less to bring them down by controlled demolition, if and when you can. It just isn't done in an urban setting because of the risk of something going wrong and the debris going in too many places.
Yes, sir.
I was just kind of expanding on that. I think to maybe expand on it would be like the nanothermite cost, because you're saying that it's like a super high-end material, so wouldn't that weigh into the cost effectiveness of it? Wouldn't that make it expensive?
Well, why is this an issue is one question. I mean, we're looking at billions and billions of dollars that were made by the oil industry, the banking industry, who always makes out on war, the arms industry, of course, the media itself, who, in covering up these conspiracies, reap enormous benefits from the headlines and the sales and media. So we're looking at these corporations who have the same people on the boards of directors of each other. So they move as a block with interlocking boards of directors. And that's why perhaps we don't see on mainstream media any whistleblowers, because after all, 90% of the media in the United States is owned just by 6 corporations, who are in turn controlled by those other corporations I just highlighted. Pretty interesting. Yes, sir?
You said that you generally don't take down steel buildings by controlled demolition. Would there have been some risk on the part of people who did blow the buildings that maybe they blow it? I mean, blow it meaning that they wouldn't succeed in fully demolishing it by controlled demolition? Or if you just have enough explosives in there?
There would have been a significant risk that something go wrong in a situation like that, and it would be my expectation that it was over-designed
which might be why
to
you
accommodate that.
A 1,400-foot diameter of destruction and no pile of floors found at the bottom. I don't think I would have done it like that in a deceptive, controlled demolition. I would have wanted to look like a pancaking collapse. And yet almost all the concrete was pulverized to a fine powder, as you heard. 220 acres of fluted metal decking upon which the concrete is poured are virtually missing. They are found in small metal filings in all of the World Trade Center dust, which I found myself, putting a magnet to these dust samples.
There's an important psychological part of that. I'm a clinical psychologist, studied that practice for 25 years. The point was to make it overly awful. This is what the human mind can't handle. They kind of touched on it with the cognitive dissonance. But if you look at the big lie with Hitler and extrapolate on that, it had to be something overwhelmingly awful so that the human system, A, couldn't handle it as something it had ever handled before, and secondly, to accept that it happened and all the implications that they talked about. It had to be overly awful.
Excellent. Yes?
So if it had to be that they created this spectacle, so now they created a grand spectacle, and now they leave all the people in questions of how really the government really is, and you really trust the government that you think is out to protect you, because it could be a real two-faced game. It's a mixed bag of shells. On one hand, they may say, yeah, we're out to protect you, but then we're not out to protect you at the same time. It might be two things happen simultaneously with each other. They just don't let you see it.
Excellent. Yes, sir.
You know, early in your movie, you said, how did 2 planes bring down 3 buildings? And, you know, you said this is an orchestrated event. And you're struggling with how does this even happen, right? I mean,
what, me?
Yeah.
No, actually, I'm pretty much a believer, but I just didn't like the idea of here.
And Building 7 is the one. I mean, when you guys were going back and forth about the structure of the steel, and I'm thinking, okay, how do you melt iron, right, with jet fuel? A, right? You don't. Okay. And 2, how does this Building 7 come down with basically a little office fire?
Yeah.
And whoever orchestrated this, here's the theory, is that third plane, guy 93, that was meant for building 7. Because you had to take the first 2 towers down. And when those were down, then the third plane could come in and take down building 7. When that thing went AWOL, they were stuck with, I mean, I saw the video where he says, pull it, right? Now he's stuck with a building that's got demolition right throughout. What does he do with it? He's got no choice. See, that was the whole thing. That was the weakness, because that's where it fell apart. When that plane went down, now they go, what the heck we're going to do now? Right? We got a building with that's ready to demo. We got no plane to basically start the chain. We're screwed. So at 5 o'clock, he's like, what do? Right? Pull it. We got to take this thing down. And then we'll make up a story later. We'll cover up us later. And that's where you got to stick to building 7. And you got to find some marketing people, because you got to get the politicians ready to bring this thing to the floor and say, enough is enough, right? And we got to get this thing rolling. Because you gotta get someone who knows marketing who can get this thing, because you have building 7. You have irrefutable evidence that shows this is not what NIST said.
Excellent.
The official report on what brought building 7 down is so full of errors, glaring errors. That's where we're starting our litigation. Is to begin to press, because it just boggles my mind to think that they would even put out the stuff they put out to justify how that building came down.
Look at the hand they were dealt. They had no cards. They had nothing to cover. Right.
Well, and yet there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of architects and engineers around the world who just bought the story, and they didn't have a feedback mechanism that was effective for determining who wasn't satisfied with it, nor did they have a proper distribution system for telling the architects and engineers what the story was. Most architects and engineers know nothing about the third worst structural failure in modern history. And there it is. So they too were traumatized, just like the rest of us. They and me, I mean, I didn't learn about this for 5 years. Any other information, alternative information about this, I didn't have any interest in going back and looking about how those towers came down. I was in a state of shock that morning, just like everybody else. It's just not fun to even imagine going back there, because it's painful. We don't want to do it. Yes, sir.
I congratulate you on an awesome, effective, convincing documentary. I too make documentaries. My service is called Video Mission. And my most recent production is an exposure of the cover-ups in the Kennedy assassinations. And for 8 years, to my shame, I was part of the government disinformation program. I worked at a very prominent Air Force base that the public thinks is all fun and games, but really it's not. And you are wise to be cautious, precautious about getting too much into theorizing who really did it, because your agency will be infiltrated with crackpots who will discredit it. That's how the government operates. And by the by, I'm from New York, and I lived, well, the second plane flew right over my house. We didn't know that the tower had been attacked, so I ran in, because, we're used to airplanes in the air, but they're always slow and high approaching Newark. Well, this thing was doing just the opposite, rushing toward Manhattan, so I ran in and caught the collision.
On TV?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I just had a question about who was not at work that day in Towers 1 and 2.
There's talk that some people were given early warning and went home. Anybody want to comment on that? Because I don't have a comment.
I can add this to what Richard has said. There are a couple of documentaries out there that identify who those people were that were not at work in 1 and 2. You search around a little bit. There's a very well done documentary. It's fairly new. It's about unfortunately, it's about 5 hours long.
Oh, it's called the 9/11 A New Pearl Harbor.
Yes, and it examines the airplanes, buildings 1 and 2, the Pentagon, who was not at work, and a whole bunch of areas where we don't go. And it's broken up into about 7 segments, as I recall, and you can watch it takes three DVDs to hold it. You can watch it a segment at a time and come back to it the next day and watch it again, watch the next segment. And if you haven't done it, I think it's worth the effort, because it'll give you a lot of background information that's now in the public domain without, it asks the questions, but what the question it really asks is for you to make up your own mind based upon the evidence that we do know.
And it answers the questions that was raised, for instance, what about popular mechanics? Didn't they debunk you guys? It takes every one, the major debunker statements, if you will, so-called debunker, and addresses them. Not just relative to the 3 towers, in which they use our elements of the movie you saw tonight, but also the large span of activities that happen in and around 9/11, such as put options where millions were made, betting that the airliner values would go way down as a result of what would happen the next day. The drills that we saw with the Air Force and NORAD, and many other aspects, the behavior of the Bush administration in and around the times of 9/11 and following. Question?
I was just curious, I'd like to see the fast track here. I mean, the laws of justice can be so slow, the cause of justice and all that. You mentioned whistleblower. If presumably for something like this to happen, there'd have to be dozens, if not hundreds of people that know the story, even if it's compartmentalized or whatever it is. But it seems to me it would be useful to have a platform for that whistleblower to give the information, and then have some assurance that he's not going to be killed and his family killed and his friend killed. Because he doesn't have that right now. Is there anybody working on creating such a theater for that person to step up to and have his back for a little bit, to fast track it, and actually have more than just circumstantial evidence, to actually have somebody that was there?
Yeah, we're singularly incapable of providing such securities for whistleblowers. Do you have anything else to add on that one? Yeah, so we've had a couple of people call us, and I don't know if they're real or not, but we didn't get any hard, cold facts. So we basically refer them to international whistleblower organizations such as Citadel Edmonds, BoilingFrogs.org, I think it is. And there are some other good organizations that come from that world that know how to help people. But no, we haven't gotten anybody calling us say, hey, I helped blow up those towers, what do I do? I think God only knows if those people are even still alive. We just don't know. It's a dark hole. Speaking of patience, how is it going with the JFK explosion? 50 years.
I think the number of people who could have disproven the Warren report is up to about 90 now, who have either met a violent death or an unfortunate accident. And the only way, the closer you get to disproving the government's point of view, that they are relentless and ruthless, and you yourself will meet an unfortunate accident. The only thing we can do at this point, by the way, this is not America anymore. That's gone. Our government laughs at the Constitution. Overseas, for example, Canada, get someone in a government that people have trust in, Americans have trust in, and have them look into this. In the 90s, there was a British miniseries, The Men Who Killed Kennedy. It's never been shown in America except on the History Channel. And they show absolute proof that the government did it. They have a recording made 13 days before Kennedy was assassinated, spelling out the whole thing. in detail. And not only did the FBI not bother to take action, they told the CIA, don't bother coming to Dallas, there's no problem there. And it's an interview of one of the Green Berets who was trained in CIA assassinations, who was asked to kill a Navy commander at Bethesda who knew that the autopsy was a cover-up. It's mind-boggling. It's like a 9-part series. The Men Who Killed Kennedy.
Thank you. Slightly off topic, but very important. Yes.
This also might be a little off topic, but I was just wondering if in your research you guys uncovered any trails relating to any other national conspiracies since...
You can log in.
Show me now. Other conspiracies?
There is a theory out there that what happened in Oklahoma City is another action by our government. That's probably the most glaring one that's happened that I know of.
Well, the 1993.
We don't follow that. I just happen to know that there is another movement that is following that.
Yeah, the World Trade Center bombing in the garage in '93 was actually set up by an FBI informant. They actually supplied the explosives to that guy and everything. If you look into that,
that came out in court.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a very amateurish event to do something because it wouldn't have done anything.
Well, we don't know what the whole plan was either. Maybe there were supposed to be other trucks that were supposed to land in the right places in 1993 in the World Trade Center when bombs did go off. Robert mentioned the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. The movie is called A Noble Lie, and they do present very convincing evidence there. In the UK, on 7707, I think it was, we had bombing. It turns out there were drills in the UK as well. Those drills were simulating bombings. Those bombings happened in buses. Those buses were the same buses and trains that were eventually hit on the same day. So a lot of these things occur under cover of drills, such as 9/11, for instance. So when we hear about these major drills, we all get kind of nervous. FEMA's been having all kinds of drills recently. The killings that have happened in theaters and with Sandy Hook and so forth, if you look at some of the research outside the mainstream media, you uncover a lot of very uncomfortable facts which force one to examine the level of complicity and cover-up that are going on. And what would be the reason? What would be the motive that elements within government would be complicit in covering up such crimes? And I'm not even going to speculate, but if anybody wants to, I think the question is in the air. Go ahead. Yes.
It's more of a comment.
Why don't you first and then?
Okay. I was going to say that it was probably to pass bills, controversial bills going through Congress at the time. They were really, really well timed. All of these events have the common theme where FEMA was there on an exercise for the exact same stuff that happened, or whatever their national response team was, and there was some stuff that at the time that they knew there was no chance of it getting passed because no one could agree on anything, and that was the only way to affect public opinion on such a large scale.
Excellent. Yes, sir?
That was the exact same thing I was going to
Okay. Yes, sir.
The other part is psychological. There's lots of evidence that Boston was a test case, the marathon. Martial law was declared, everybody ran into their houses, everybody was told what to do, they all did it, and then when the perpetrators were found, everybody ran into the street and celebrated, my government is wonderful, they protected me, and when people are constantly in fear of something bad happening, and they reference fear in your movie, then they will accept anything that is offered to them to reduce their fear. And that's always about checking on people, checking on your neighbors, reporting on people, report what you see, and turning people who are like us here tonight. So the motive is very clear. It's to keep us afraid and to let us know that the government is the one who will keep us safe.
And as far as these shootings, many people theorize that the government might actually be interested in removing the Second Amendment right to bear arms, which was put into place not to give us our right to hunt ducks or whatever, but under the advice of the forefathers who said a government that fears its people is a government that's going to stay in line. So the Second Amendment is there to keep tyranny from happening, and yet it's tyranny that is after our right to defend ourselves. Yes?
I don't know his name. He was a CBS reporter, and about a dozen years ago he wrote a book, Fear. And the whole premise of the book is that our government wants us to be afraid, so that we will accept anything they do.
So we don't condone these conversations, but it's very difficult for me to draw the line personally and cut them off and not actually even inspire them because the information leads you straight to the discussion we're having now. And so it's very difficult for me as an architect and as an organization of credible professionals who is presenting scientific forensic evidence and with a statement that we don't know who is responsible for this, but let's have a real investigation, let the chips fall where they may, and just kind of leave it at that because people go away kind of without the deeper understanding that it is necessary, and most of this information is coming, the important information is coming from you guys. Yes?
What I find to be the great evil is the government. So many thousands of people are going to lose their lives at the hand of the government while they're laughing about the whole thing. And they know what's going on behind the whole thing. They're covering it up. And they have this whole thing orchestrated to eliminate people, to make people disappear. If you go up the wrong alley to find you there. It's like a mafia organization. And I'm thinking, how the heck are we supposed to respect people that are underhanded? If they're underhanded, you're supposed to bring them down, not have them in office, right? So if everybody would take a stand, how is the government going to take on the whole country? They're going to wipe everybody out in the whole country? I don't think they can take the whole country out. I think people have to take a stand somewhere and do something, and not be afraid.
There are also those who are very concerned about wars that exceed previous wars that have the effect of killing most of us, and people in our government not caring about that. In fact, maybe even planning it. Those people have done more research than me on the subject, and you might refer to them. Alex Jones is one of them. There are many, many others. Yes?
Yeah, has there been any effort to look at the steel that went to China? Was that to pay debt, to buy it back after it was remelted?
We don't have, to anybody in the 9/11 Truth Movement that I'm aware of knows what the deals made were. Why it went to China and India, by the way. We know we got this ship coming back, with steel coming back that was used to make a ship. Who knows if any of the steel was in that battleship, right? Interestingly enough. What we do know is it was sent within weeks after 9/11. The steel was not saved, and that is bad enough. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to add that fear is the greatest tool used by our government.
Fear is the greatest tool.
Wonders, it's the magic word.
What?
So if you buy fear, then you'll buy whatever they tell you that they want you to be afraid of. And I just have to say, I'm fearless.
Oh, I like that. You're fearless. I'm fearless too, but on the other hand, no one has come up to me and said, if you don't stop this, we know where you live, kind of thing. If somebody said that to me, what would my response be then? We have to ask these questions. At what point do we draw the line? Our loved ones are at stake, don't call me a hero until I've been have been face to face with the ultimate sacrifice. Right now, it's just my marriage, my house, and my career. Those are easy things to sacrifice. I mean, right?
careful.
But no, I will not stop. That's a promise. Yes?
I'd like to thank you for what you just said, Richard, and all your dedication. Just to mention, we do only have the room till 7 o'clock. They don't usually kick us out of here right away. But in closing, I would like to ask, what do you think our best shot for a new investigation is? I know there's talk about citizens, grand juries being empowered at the federal level. Do you have any knowledge of that? Or what do you think our best shot at a new investigation is? Is it just grassroots education like we've been doing the past few years? Or how do you feel the best way to get a new investigation, or if that's our goal?
Right now, it's a grassroots movement. Most of this movement didn't start until about 7 years ago.
Right.
When Richard began to put this organization together. This organization has really become an amalgamation, if you will, of the people who are truly seeking the truth and have done and are continuing to do the scientific research. As that evidence begins to continue to mount, and as our base gets larger, we will begin to see, we will begin to have the ability, shall I say, to mount more public cases, asking for judicial review that will, in fact, ultimately, I think, bring about the true, independent, technical investigation that needs to be done. Do I think it'll happen tomorrow? No. But I'm hopeful it'll happen in my lifetime.
Again, I'd like to thank you both for your contribution. Everyone here, what you just said about the grassroots movement, you may think that it's not good, you don't want to talk to people about this, but this is the way the movement has been built, and it's grown larger year by year, and I don't see it stopping. I think really the only hope for really getting the truth of this out is for people like us to keep spreading the truth among the grassroots, because that's where the power comes from. It's rarely from the top down. The courage doesn't come that way. It's from the grassroots up.
And Rich and Matt and Bob are quite active here in the community. Where can they meet you?
Yeah, I would encourage you to get on the Hope Dance email list. I don't know how many, can I just see a show of hands?
My friend who was on it,
Pardon me?
my friend who was on it passed away, and I lost your address.
Yeah, if you go to hopedance.org.
Hopedance.org.
And you search there, we do have a 9/11 local slow 9/11 email list, and I would encourage you to sign up for that.